I'm Tim Ventura from AmericanAntiGravity.com, and I'm speaking with Nick Cook, the aviation editor for Jane's Defense Weekly, and the author of the best-selling Hunt for Zero Point. I should start out by saying thanks. I sincerely appreciate your taking the time to, discuss these topics with our listeners. And I know that this is going to be an interview that gets a lot of interest online, and I've been excited about this for weeks.
Well, Tim, I'm thrilled to be able to have this opportunity. You know, you and I have spoken a lot over the past couple of years, and I rate the website. As you probably know, I often punt a lot of interested inquirers who come my way to you because I think, American Anti-Gravity is a very invaluable source of information. So keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. I sincerely appreciate it. One of the things that I found, and it almost defies explanation, has been maybe because anti-gravity and related, field effect propulsion and this whole genre of ideas, maybe it's because they're so strange, but they do kind of create strange bedfellows in a way. And I hesitate to think that, my little website would ever end up working with someone of your prestige, but I'm definitely excited to have been able to collaborate. So.
Well, I think it's a nexus. There are a lot of news groups out there, obviously, that talk about this subject, but there isn't really one that I know of that kind of puts it all together in the way that you do. So I think it's what I said. You're really providing an invaluable service, and long may it continue. Because in my experience, certainly over the last couple of years, and from the feedback I've got from the book, fortunately, right now at least, this is a subject that is not dying. It's difficult to know where it's headed in a way, but there is, I'm sure, and it's not just because I'm immersed in the subject material, and so I'm kind of more aware of the debate that is now going on around anti-gravity. But it really, it does seem to be something which has, at long last, popped its head above the kind of the parapet of respectability. As I always said in the book, while I was writing the book, I was, really kind of cautious about and somewhat trepidatious about the future. I mean, this was even, I have to pinch myself, but only 5 years ago, less than that maybe. I mean, the book came out, 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago. Even then, it was still taboo material for somebody like me in my position and profession to be talking about this subject matter. I now no longer feel that is the case. I mean, for example, just 2 weeks ago, I was in Dallas-Fort Worth giving a lecture to the Institute of Electrical Engineers in America about the very subject on their invitation. And I know for a fact that the audience was stuffed full of people from Lockheed Martin and from Bell Helicopter, and I didn't get booed out of the room. So it's definitely a move in the right direction, and it's exciting. It's exciting to be on the crest of that wave.
Definitely. One thing that I'm wondering about, you mentioned this in this summer during a speech, is the Conrath interval. And I'm wondering if possibly this might be some of the reason that we're getting this groundswell of support for these new technologies. Do you think?
Well, it may be. I mean, it's an interesting thought. I mean, it does seem as if this debate on anti-gravity, this debate on advanced propulsion, and related aspects to energy generation, this groundswell is coming from somewhere, and it's almost as if it's kind of being propelled along by some kind of consciousness shift, perhaps, which is allowing for these sorts of radical ideas previously, certainly in terms of mainstream physics, heretical ideas, being aired and promulgated to a mainstream audience. And maybe that is the kind of unwritten essence of the Conrath interval, which postulates that every 54 or 55 years, in a specific area of scientific or technical endeavor, these major leaps and breakthroughs occur. Now, aerospace analysts will tell you that the last major shift in this line of the Kondratiev interval for aerospace was was with Sputnik's launch in the mid-50s. So we are due for that next step change in the Kondratiev interval in around 2011, 2012. So, what will it be? Could it be advanced propulsion? Could it be some breakthrough in the anti-gravity field? I certainly hope so, and I certainly believe, based on this enormous sort of groundswell of support and interest in this field, that if nothing else, this is going to propel it forwards onto the agenda.
Definitely. One of the things I've wondered about for a while, my own research started in 1992, and I'd found, to some degree, there's still kind of a dichotomy where, working in IT, telecom by the day, these are both technologies and they have a lot in common. Anti-gravity, field effect, kind of the new propulsion, and IT have a lot of even similar theories. But I found, I guess, as a rule, you can't mention them during the day job. And it might be a little bit easier for you because you actually work in aviation. But the thing that's been just puzzling has been, these ideas have been around since well before the 60s. I mean, we had Buck Rogers in the 30s with a rocket plane, and then the 50s had the flying car. The 60s was probably that was probably the real birth of anti-gravity in the modern sense, the Star Trek shuttles. So it's strange that these things went from being, in the 50s, it was almost expected that this stuff would happen sooner or later. And you mentioned that in the book. The public just anticipated that it would come about. And by the 60s, and then, of course, all of the science fiction through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, anti-gravity was an inherent part of all of these plot devices. And the public just almost kind of ignored it. And so the thing that's been interesting to me has been there's been an increase in acceptance, but also kind of an increase in believability, where it's gone from being science fiction to more of science fact. And the media hasn't really covered it. I mean, aside from yourself and the excellent work that you've done covering it, the general media hasn't covered it as much. So,
well, that's true. I mean, in the general media, certainly in newsprint, there hasn't been enough written about it, I don't think. I mean, there have been things written about it, and certainly my own efforts to get stuff published in the mainstream press over the past couple of years. I mean, I have a couple of times, but it's been a bit of a struggle to get stuff into, I mean, something like the Financial Times, for example. But, credit to them, they have published it. But where I do detect an enormous upswell in interest in this in the media is in TV and radio media. I've had a great deal of approaches over the last couple of years, and certainly, and actually more so in the last 6 months than ever before, on this very subject. I mean, I know of multiple programs coming out on it because, thanks to the success of Hunt for Zero Point, they tend to come and seek me out when they're looking for a bit of, so-called expert commentary. So I would say at the moment there are probably, certainly that I know of, at least 10 TV productions and a couple of radio productions in the works on this subject. And there seems to be a kind of healthy appetite for it. So we shouldn't be completely discouraged, I don't think, by what the newsprint media does or does not carry on this subject, because elsewhere in the media it is happening. And I think, to a degree, I think TV and, well, certainly TV is the cutting edge in terms of formulating public opinion or reflecting public opinion on any given subject area. So I think in time the inherently more conservative news print media will follow. And, I await the next few years with some excitement.
definitely. Now, you've been able to change the public consciousness about anti-gravity in a number of ways, and I think one of the most important is showing the connections between some of the World War II work and some of the more modern work done in the States and perhaps Great Britain on it. I mean, there were a lot of corollaries to that also. I thought the part about importing Nazi culture into NASA in the early days was something that no one's ever addressed before, but it makes a perfect amount of sense. But people, now that they've had the time to absorb your book and really start to kind of go over it and understand what it says, do you think it's time to start releasing the next book or start writing it, I guess?
Oh, definitely. The next book is in the works, and when I say in the works, that involves a low level of writing at the moment. But I mean, I've been amassing data on the follow-up to Zero Point ever since the first book came out. The difficulty for me has been really one of kind of expectation. The problem with The Hunt for Zero Point was, whilst it was a perfect reflection of my journey over the 10 years that it took for me to kind of research it off and on, many readers wrote in and said, well, what did you actually prove in the end? Well, it really wasn't to me a question of proof in terms of pitching up in a laboratory and seeing something at work. I hoped when I set out on the journey that would be the end result. But what I learned along the way, to me, was every bit as important as actually seeing an experiment, seeing a device, seeing an effect with my own eyes, which, of course, in the end, I didn't do. So I felt that the payoff for the second book had to be some form of witnessing of some experiment, some anti-gravity type effect. And I feel that I'm close to seeing that, but I'm not there yet. So the question is, do I hang off writing this book until I see with my own eyes something to that effect? Or do I just start writing it anyway and, just look on it as a continuation of the journey? Because, as I said, what I encountered along the way and some of the things which kind of popped out of the woodwork, I mean, you mentioned one earlier, which was this observation that, and in the end, it was only really through writing the book that I came to conclude this, that some of the culture that was imported from Nazi Germany into the States, and of course America did recruit German scientists in a much more all-embracing way than any of the other allies did. There was always this danger that there was going to be some rub-off of the ideology into certain sections of the aerospace and defense industry. Now, I've covered the aerospace and defense industry in America and elsewhere for a very long time, and whilst 99% of it is a good and healthy place, and I have many good contacts and many good friends in the industry, there is always that corner of it where secrecy perhaps gets out of control, that if you're not careful, the checks and balances go away. And I do know people who have been greatly intimidated by black world culture in the U.S. defense industry. And I think it behoves all of us to beware of where that can lead. So, it's observations like that, I felt, were every bit as important as the end point of the journey. So maybe I'm just going to get on with it and just start writing that second book.
Well, one thing I should ask, and I don't want to dwell on the topic too long, but for me, I've noticed somewhat of a culture of fear, I guess. And I know part of that comes from this community of inventors themselves. I think a lot of the myths that we have as inventors prevent us from moving forward. We're convinced that somebody will steal the idea from the patent office or whatever, and it ends up kind of hamstringing a lot of the people who would be doing the really great breakthrough work. But the other part has been, in doing some of the research I've done for the website, I'm noticing that this culture of fear still exists. It appears to have changed. It doesn't seem like it's the Big Brother 1980s era stuff. It's more of a, every now and then I'll reach a certain subject and I'll be asking the wrong type of questions, and I'll just kind of get a hint that says, Tim, you really shouldn't be asking these questions. And, but I've seen that in a few places, and so I wonder if it still exists today and how it's changed.
Well, it does still exist, unquestionably. every now and again I do bump up against it. It's mutated a little bit. I mean, during the 1980s, of course, that was the biggest period of black world expenditure build-up that the U.S. defense industry has ever seen. Of course, it's the expenditure, which kind of amounted to, there are varying estimates, but let's say around $40 billion a year in secret research and development and acquisition expenditure in the mid to late 80s. That has tailed away. But of course, post 9/11, particularly, the black world has come into its own again. I think that's sad in many ways, in a vast number of ways, because whilst I truly believe that secrecy is good for certain defense programs, like I said earlier, if you're not careful, if there aren't checks and balances, and if there is, if all of this is kind of fed by a culture of suspicion and paranoia, such as there is now with Al-Qaeda rampant out there, things can spiral out of control again, and I'm naturally not for that. Although I do accept, of course, having covered the defense industry for 20-odd years, that secrecy is important. We need secrecy, but it should always be checked and balanced by democracy. So we need to be careful of that.
Definitely. Well, and in terms of new technologies, I think a good comparison might be with computer technology. Computers started out originally as, either secret or proprietary to, Bell Corporation and some of the other larger companies using them for telephone and other work. And, before they got into the public hands, I think that the case could have been made that this is the kind of thing that, the bad guys could use. But yet they impacted the economy while they were still used by only the big corporations and the government. But it was only after they got into the hands of the public that the world truly changed. And I think that anti-gravity may be something similar, where, if the government is able to cook up something that works, as advertised, works perfectly with no flaws, it may help them deploy troops, it may help them move materials, and if they can do it in secret, more power to them. But at the same time, I don't think it'll really transform the face of the planet until it becomes something that, mom and the kids can go to school in every day.
Yeah, but I also think that there is a very strong tie between the anti-gravity field and the zero-point energy field, the exotic energy generation field. And I think probably that is where the breakthrough is going to come first in terms of getting something to market in a commercial arena. I already know of a number of inventors who seem to be producing vaguely usable amounts of power output. And I'm still relatively convinced that at some point in the near future, someone is going to surprise the world by coming out with some kind of device which you can put in your home or your backyard, which is going to, give you usable amounts of electricity. You can perhaps run your home off or parts of your home off. Maybe it's going to be the Japanese. Lord knows, I know that outfits like Toshiba were expressing extreme interest at one point in Podkletnov's work. Now that was obviously in the anti-gravity field, but there is, as you know, a close correlation between anti-gravity developments and energy generation developments. If Ning Li, for example, is generating 11 kilowatts of usable power output from a superconducting disk, which she says she's getting a gravity-like force field from, well, that can be very easily switched to power generation. So I suspect that's probably where the commercial breakthrough will happen first. But let's not forget too that we seem to be dealing here with science that people don't properly understand. We're getting data in advance of the theory. which of course always leaves scientists very uncomfortable. So it may be that this stuff will be squashed on initially by the military defense, by the defense industrial complex. But again, getting back to how we opened this conversation up, there is now such a movement underpinning work in this field in the public arena, aided and abetted by the internet and people communicating on the web, that I just don't think that the lid can be kept on this by the military. It's clearly a subject of great interest to them, as you know. You've, I know, have looked into the whereabouts of Ning Li and what her work has entailed for U.S. Army Missile Command. So, yeah, and in my experience, the military, although they are prone to mistakes like the rest of us, do not willy-nilly throw money at completely crackpot ideas. So it's a subject of interest to them, it's a subject of interest to us, and I feel it's only a matter of a very short time from now before this is going to break out into the mainstream.
Certainly.
So we'll see.
Well, to take a jump back in time just a bit, one of the things you'd mentioned in the end of Hunt for Zero Point, and it was almost in the unresolved issues category, was the mystery site in Poland. And as I understand, you've just taken a trip there to learn a little bit more about it. Now, I know some of this is still proprietary information because I don't want to give away the plot to your next book, but, is there anything you can tell us offhand about what you've learned about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently involved in a documentary film, and we just went over to Poland for a couple of days to carry out some filming at the site of the mine, which readers of the Hunt for Zero Point will know about, but it was a mine in southern Poland which was part of a giant German-run research and development and production complex. And that whole area there is in the lower Silesian region of Germany, as it once was just this giant secret location for interesting, to put it mildly, R&D work. And although I was able to reach a number of conclusions based on the data that came out of that region and out of archive evidence too, underpinning what the Germans were up to. And I should add that this is activity which is just not documented in official history books of the Second World War. I'm interested in the Second World War. I've always been interested in the Second World War, and I know quite a lot about it. But it was really a revelation to me to find that in files, official files, which I found, and by looking at archaeological evidence on the ground, such as there is currently in southern Poland and elsewhere, there is a tremendous amount of you can draw real conclusions about what these people were up to. And on this latest trip, what I have found, what I can talk about, is that I have found much more corroborating evidence to show that not only were the Germans working on let's call it experiments which really sought to plumb the mysteries of space-time, including the gravity field, but they were also looking to apply that knowledge in a much more experimental stage than I previously considered to practical designs. And that's probably about as far as I can go at the moment. But the evidence is there. It's there for anyone to see. It just needs to be put together with all with the rest of the background that we have. And I've got to say it is a fascinating area. And so the second book, whenever it does eventually come out, but I'm hoping certainly within a year, will contain I know more interesting revelations and some definitive conclusions about what the Germans were really up to.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would expect that it would have some real breakthroughs in it. If nothing else, I think you're probably In some ways, I have kind of the same response, but I know that you get emails all the time from all over the world, and a lot of them are people saying, thank you for your work, but others are people giving you leads and giving you information, and I get some of that myself, and in my case, I try and follow up as best I can, but I would expect that that's taken you some interesting places.
Well, it has, and I really value all of this feedback. I mean, it's been terrific. But I probably ought to take this opportunity to not only to thank people for that information, but also just to explain that because you get so many varied and interesting leads, it's not possible to follow them all up, and I'm sure you find that. Some of them I do, and some I have to put on the back burner for a little while. But yeah, but thanks to the feedback that I've got, I have been taken into a number of new areas. And it has been very interesting. And so again, the book the new book will pick up on some of the themes of the original, but I very much hope it'll take the whole subject into a new direction, and that it will continue to be accessible, because that was really a very key factor for me, was that this is, if we're not careful, this is a very arcane and esoteric subject area, which can be viewed as impenetrable by some people. I feel it behoves me to try and make this information as accessible as possible, and I've always thought to do that. I know you seek to do that, and it's really, I think, only by making it accessible and stripped of the gobbledygook that can colour some of this information, that people are going to, really kind of awaken to the possibilities on a large scale.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah, one of the things I've tried to do also is kind of provide a ready resource for inventors and people working in this area with an interest, or people who just have an idea about something they want to build. Partly so they don't keep reinventing, the magnetic motor over and over again, because I know there are a million different designs and patents for those, and they're all the same. Or doing something, like the Beefield Brown. Every 20 years it pops back up, and every 20 years it's the brand new thing, and then we start to realize that, it's been around for a while. Although, there have been some interesting new developments. The Perendev magnetic motor is something I've been keeping my eye on. And that's a South African inventor, I believe. And he has video on the web. I'm not sure how real it is, but it shows it clamping a clamp together, and the motor begins to spin without any power. So
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in terms of other work, I'm not sure if you've ever seen any tie-ins to a gentleman named W.A. Harbinson. When I read the World War II section of Zero Point, and I know at the time you didn't seem to have seen any of this, but in an interesting parallel, Harbison wrote a book called Genesis, which was part of what was later called the Project Saucer series. And the thing that was really mind-blowing was when I was reading the middle of the book, the research that you had done independently into Hans Kammler and some of the other things, you took it farther than he did, but he also reinforced, way back when, a lot of the same timelines and events, and kind of the same feel that you had for things. Not sure if you've run across his book or writings.
Yeah, I have, actually. I mean, I never came across his fiction, although I was aware that it existed. But I had read a non-fiction book of his, which was either called Project UFO or Project Saucer. I can't remember which. I think it was Project UFO, which was it was a non-fiction distillation, I guess, of all the research that he'd done for the original for his novels. And it was interesting. It was very interesting. And when it came out, it was it must have been about in the mid 1990s, I think. And I was really hoping for great things. The problem with not just his work as I see it, but also others in that genre about what the Germans were up to, is that for me it was unverifiable data. It was not backed up by good source indications as to where this material had come from. what I really tried to do in Zero Point was um, was set down what was verified as fact and what was verified or what was portrayed as legend. And because the problem with the whole German UFO saucer story is that these two have just got completely intertwined, and it is very difficult to sift the good information from the bad in it. And although Harbinson had some very interesting material in there, it just wasn't backed up with the sort of archival evidence that I would have liked to have seen. But that wasn't just his work; it was others too. And so that's where I feel that there's still an awful lot more work to be done on quantifying what the Germans were really up to during the Second World War. And as I said earlier, that story has not been written or reflected in mainstream historical works on Germany and what the Germans achieved during the Second World War from a science and technology point of view. And of course the difficulty, I understand where that difficulty lies, is because unfortunately the people who were carrying out the research tended to be the ardent Nazi types, and many of them were involved in the crimes of the Holocaust. And for all sorts of reasons, not least because they themselves were intent on covering their tracks to hide these horrendous crimes that they committed, they wiped out as well a lot of the science and technology work that was also being carried out in parallel. So investigating this stuff is a minefield. It's incredibly difficult, and it is still very difficult to sift good information from bad. But the records are there, and in many cases, and it is possible to carry out good analysis on it. And again, I'm hoping that in the second book we'll be able to tie that story down more firmly than I did even in the first one.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's interesting to think that not only, through the research that you're doing and the writing that you're doing, not only are you having a major impact on kind of the culture of anti-gravity, I guess, if you will, but also just possibly you may be rewriting the end of World War II in some ways, which is kind of a dual-pronged approach. It's a lot for just writing a book, but you've done a remarkable job.
The great thing about Zero Point, and why I have this great affection for it and the time that I was writing it, was that although nominally I was set on this course to try and find the answer to the anti-gravity riddle, had we cracked it, was it possible that some UFO sightings may have been attributable to real-world activity by us in the anti-gravity field? Even though that was the line on which I determined to walk, either side of that line there were some fascinating fields that just were begging to be covered, and one of them was this unwritten side of what happened in Germany right at the end of the Second World War. I mean, I had no idea, because all the books really that I've ever read on the subject just don't pay him any attention, that Hans Kammler was as powerful a man as he certainly was at the end of the Second World War. This guy barely rates a mention in any history book that you'll ever pick up on the history of the Third Reich. And yet this guy who clearly set out always to be a mercurial figure, he certainly never wanted any limelight. And at the end of the war, as far as I can make out, he engineered his own disappearance. Why has nothing meaningful ever been written on this guy? That was it. I could almost have written a book on that entire subject alone, but of course discipline kept on pulling me back to the main line of the investigation. So in many ways it's given me kind of spin-off avenues of interest, which I'm still pursuing.
Definitely. Well, in terms of UFOs, and this is a subject that I hesitate to broach because I've had maybe kind of a negative experience with it. I actually sort of saw a UFO of my own in 1994, and I wasn't able to ever explain it or categorize the event. But one of the challenges that I've had, especially with my research, has been the more deeply I get into anti-gravity, in some ways, the farther away from UFOs it pulls me. I'm just not seeing the tie-ins, and I'm wondering if you've seen the tie-ins there, or if you've seen anything that says maybe there have been claims that we're taking technology from ETs and government labs, or have you seen anything like that that kind of rings a bell, or?
Well, I suppose what I am detecting is a kind of coming together of the exotic propulsion field with a view in certain sections of the aerospace and defense community who are interested in that field of advanced propulsion, field propulsion, anti-gravity, call it what you will, that why not look on UFOs as an intelligence target? Why not look on them in the same way that you would back in the Cold War when you were analyzing a Soviet military aircraft that for the first time popped up on a radar screen or popped up in the on a satellite photograph? There is, if you accept that some UFO sightings data, particularly photographs of UFOs, represent real evidence, then there is potentially information to be derived from analyzing that evidence in a photograph. And what I am detecting in the aerospace and defense community, albeit at the very fringes, is a desire to analyze UFO sightings multispectrally, where you do get instances of multiple sensors being brought to bear on a UFO encounter. And we had that, for instance, quite recently in Mexico, where I think back in May, when the Mexican Minister of Defense said, we've had some sightings over Mexico, they were documented by our Air Force, they were plotted on radar and they were plotted on infrared sensors, and we're baffled, but we're throwing it open to the world saying, can you help us analyze what we've got here? So in that sense, there is a kind of slight coming together of these two worlds, the advanced propulsion world and the UFO world. But there's still a long way to go there, and for many people, it remains uncertain territory. So, but there's potential for work there.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's a challenge though, because it branches yet kind of another taboo discipline, I guess. I always like to think that you can talk about anti-gravity or talk about UFOs, but usually not in the same place at the same time. And so
I think you're right. It's probably bringing two taboos too many together too quickly. So maybe that'll have to wait for a bit.
Yeah. Well, and later on also, one of the things that I've always thought has been, if we can come forward at some point and be able to bring the public a device that, like Device X, where it lifts off, flies around, obviously anti-gravity, then how does that then let us categorize UFO sightings? Maybe we can reverse apply that and say, well, now that we have an understanding of how this device works, how would some UFO sightings possibly fit into this? So it might...
Absolutely.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I think we're almost out of time for today. I'd definitely like to do a follow-up sometime if you have additional time and the wherewithal to go forward with it. But I'm not sure if that sounds like a good idea, if you have more to share, or if you'd like to wait for a while.
Well, by all means. I mean, maybe if you want to let this one sort of settle and assimilate, and if you've got any more questions, give me a call.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again for your time, Nick, and on behalf of pretty much everyone who's read your book, thank you for writing it, and we're all looking forward to reading your next one. The insights that you've had have just been brilliant insights, and they're insights that no one else would have been able to have without your experience in aerospace. So...
Well, thanks, Tim, and to everyone out there who has read the book, and particularly those who sent me, messages of encouragement. I am very grateful, and it means a lot. And just to let the folks know that I'm continuing on the path. So more in due course.
Okay, and I think with that, we'll close for today.